In 1998, I was young enough to be the prime target for Pokémon fanaticism. The worship of these digital monsters swept my school halls, the consequences of which can still be felt today. Of which version you chose, and of which little buddy you chose to start your adventure with, drew the line in the proverbial sand. Friendships and rivalries with people you didn't even know were set in motion. Game Freak had taken aim and scored a direct hit. Though Pokefever eventually died and my gaming interests spread amongst a wide variety of different games, Pokemon's influence built a rock-solid foundation for my tastes in video games, the strength of which I can feel even today. From time to time, I would check back in on the series, always watching from afar as the newest generation came out, hungry to hear the take of the newest generation of Pokemon fans. Casually, I would pop into the electronics section of my local Walmart and scan the cases of the newest releases, and what would I find? Pokemon. The desire to revisit this rich part of my childhood interest has reared its head from time to time, most notably at the release of the Nintendo Switch titles and 2016's second coming, Pokemon Go. Pokemon had came into my sister and I's life courtesy of my grandmother. It was one of two games she knew. Her knowledge and subsequent purchase of Red and Blue version were based off of her knowledge of my older cousin's interest in video games. The other game she knew was Sega's Crazy Taxi. She knew kids liked video games, and she knew kids are playing Pokemon. We came home one day to both copies laying on the kitchen table, a gift from one of her semi-regular visits to our house. My mouth dried, my hands began shaking. The shock of the surprise had stunned me, but I knew we had to make a choice. The only choice someone must make when acquiring a new copy of Pokemon. Who got which version? The choice was simple. I did not, however, know the intense years-long journey that initial choice would take me on. I chose Red version, because Red is better than Blue. And for me, that was as good of a reason as any. Plus, the fire-breathing dragon on the front cover of the copy of Red would beat the overweight sea turtle any day in a real fight. I would continue to collect each new game in this series up until the Ruby version, where ultimately what happens with all Pokemon fans happened to me. I grew up. The cold, long fingers of pre-teenhood grasping at my wrist and dragging me into the depths of indie rock and emo JRPG protagonist-inspired attitude. No matter how far down I was drugged though, I would never deny the cotton candy-ish sweetness Pokemon lined my earliest gaming experiences with. They're like your old friend's big brother who came around from time to time and gave you a case of beer once. Pokemon was my gateway drug into the massive world of JRPGs. The subtle dance of the turn-based combat, the seemingly endless roster of virtual pets to capture and train, the densely populated towns tucked cozily into a bed of interconnected routes hooked me from minute one. So I choose here today to revisit this series, itself well into adulthood. From my own adult eyes, will the game reveal itself cracked and worn? The varnish slowly peeling, revealing a crusty interior, grown old and feeble with time? Or will it yield a single fruit, juicier and sweeter than I've ever known? My craving built upon by the disappointment from a mountainous backlog of AAA video games that no amount of 10-year development cycles and day one patches could ever fix. You'll have to stick around to find out. To make condensing my thoughts more simple, I've divided this talk into 4 segments. Only 4? I hear you whisper? Trust me, if I wasn't working a full-time job, it'd be more. Maybe one day I could spend even more time talking about some of the later games in the series. Foreshadowing aside, we press on to Chapter 1, Pokemon, Breath of the Wild. What's most important when making a review or critique of beloved media from when you were young is trying to stay as objective as possible. That being said, let me open with this statement. Pokemon is better than Breath of the Wild. Oops, you caught me. This chapter was going to be my stealth attempt at disclosing how much I dislike modern open world games. Now that the cat is out of the bag though, let's try a more direct approach. I would rather slam my head into a wall than stare at another miles-long blank map, only to find out that I have to fill it in by climbing up some structure or another, only to reveal points of interest that are always less fun than doing my own taxes. The same establishing shot of an expansive world that promises you a good time exists at the front end of each of these games, and it takes a little of my soul with it each time. Link running to a panning shot of Hyrule Castle in the background of the Great Plateau. In Skyrim, emerging from the cavern after an escape from a dragon attack to a beautiful forest full of intrigue, like in Pokémon, Sword and Shield. Most of the games at the time Pokémon came out dealt with open worlds using some kind of abstract world map. Think the Final Fantasy games. They give you the impression you're on a world-trotting adventure, but are really level select screens with an in-game application. Our minds always imagined the walk from Midgard to Calm as being a slow walk, full of conversation and occasional battle, but the reality was much more grim. As we scooted 20 steps on an earth-textured chessboard, making way to the closest 3D model of a town the same size as our player character, the shock of just having each screen in the hours-long Midgar section harshly juxtaposing against its overworld was disappointing to say the least. But did they make the right choice in using this form of getting from level to level? If we imagine the technology had existed to have made Final Fantasy VII with a Witcher-style open world, would bigger have been better? No, it wouldn't. Pokemon rejected this abstracted approach and, even if limited by technological limitations, doesn't overcorrect with an empty world full of endless routes with nothing to do. By the time we wrap back around its map and start our way towards Elite Four, I feel like I've gone on an actual road trip, the kind Final Fantasy XV wanted you to feel like you had, and I've done it all in a more organic way. 15 had 3 different environments and 1 town and a handful of copy and pasted gas stations. These are the things that make these big games feel so small. 1 million shrines, 2 million of the same Koroks, 4 of the same dungeon doesn't make me interested. I'll take a more curated section of environments any day, and this is how we come to what makes Pokemon World so special. Bigger is not better. In the same way, a linear hall of environments that moves you from cutscene to cutscene is also bad, and remind you somewhat lovingly that you're actually playing a video game. Open worlds fail and are so often described as empty because their steadfast adherence to a design ethos of being grounded in reality. The kicker is that you can't replicate a world-spanning journey when it only takes 10 minutes to travel from one end of the map to the other because of the development of a map that size already takes years. But you don't want to do that anyway because most of that time walking or traveling via other means is just boring. And it's made even more so by the abundance of mindless interest points and resource locations. This is the reason that open world games have fast travel options. Developers know that there isn't an important reason, mechanically speaking, for a player to travel from A to B when it's all just open terrain. All those doors with nothing behind them. These experiences are often rich on a first playthrough, but are quickly made less impressive the more these types of games we play. Open world games now remind me of Muso games, the reskinned Dynasty Warriors clones. Each new open world game contains the same things the others do: climbing towers to unlock your map in Assassin's Creed, mechanical dinosaurs in Horizon, ancient watchtowers in Zelda. Hideo Kojima's Death Stranding sought to explore at least a mechanical level of what exactly traversal means in an open world game. And its controversial reception and lack of any critical conversation surrounding it now speaks for itself on the topic, I think. This style of game is especially at odds with games that also attempt to have an urgent story, which is an essential part of all modern games now. Pokémon sought the high road and embraced non-linear areas with an overall linear level design to make a truly expansive world. Pokémon's world is the center of its attention. Its rich ecosystem of animals all inhabit well throughout different parts of the world, and how you interact with them in these different areas is at the core of your experience with the game. That's the true definition of an open world to me. A game where instead of the open world aspect being a feature, a selling point, or in the case of modern game development, a necessity, and only being supplementary to the other systems of gameplay, the focus is on the actual world itself. The line of distinction between the two hypothetical games may be small, but it's razor sharp. Let's change gears quickly and dive headfirst into some of the ways that Pokémon was on the cutting edge of all the top open world fads seen today. In Pokémon, the Pokémon are the side quest. Gotta catch them all isn't a suggestion, it's an ethos. The mental gymnastics required to track down and remember which wild Pokémon show up where, and the endless tables of catch rate statistics is mind-boggling. With an effort only seen out of master birdwatchers, you must prepare yourself. There are many missable Pokémon, Pokémon that can only be obtained in trades, Pokémon that have item and story requirements first. At any new route, the game hands you a sampler-sized list of Pokémon that are usually in some way helpful to the upcoming area or gym battle. And based on how your team is faring, it may behoove you to seek out and capture these Pokémon. Instead of going to a town center and taking a Witcher-style hunt from a magic side quest giving board and running to then some arbitrary location on an already bloated map to track down said monster, you need now only consult the nearest tall grass to inform you of what monsters are available and also what these monsters typing might say about the area you're getting ready to explore. The game is non-linear in all the right ways. Thanks to the internet sleuths and closet statistics fanatics, we now know that there is 60 possible combinations to challenge the gyms in Pokemon Red and Blue. Not only a bigger challenge than fighting Ganon right after the tutorial, I mean Great Plateau, but also definitely more interesting than the copy and pasted shrines of Breath of the Wild. Just another great example of how to make more with less. With a more refined set of dungeon levels in this style of open world, more attention can be placed into all the different combinations and how they are presented to the player. Pokemon even has fishing, the staple of any true open world game. Our goal this time though is not for some record that concerns length, but an addition to our carefully curated team of killing machines. We cast out our rods, waiting for the monsters roaming the deep to answer our challenge. Most open world games would opt to make fishing a mundane mechanic relegated to a mere side activity status, rather than something so integrated into all aspects of gameplay and world building. In even the shallowest bodies of fluid, the world building makes its statement true. Rather than a lore-rich tablet explaining some persuasion of magical happening or another, there lay a water-breathing creature capable of capture and competitive fighting, and at very least a Magikarp, capable of splashing foes. Theorists have long suggested that the physics-based gameplay in Breath of the Wild's Sheikah Slate was actually inspired by Pokémon. In Pokémon, we receive HM moves that are moves that serve various functions on the overworld. We use them in certain contextual situations to affect the environments we are moving through, such as moving giant boulders and lighting dark paths, or even surfing through the sea. Pokémon really was ahead of its time. Whoa, don't call the cops just yet. I'm just saying, when a game with a file size that could fit on a GameBoy cartridge in the late 90s so accurately and successfully predicted the formula for one of the most popular genres of single-player AAA video games today, that even the most Extreme technical and financial limitations aren't the problem for why so many open world games end up being so disappointing. Pokemon's battles, when played as intended, can be a beautiful dance. The game sometimes plays more like a sports team manager simulator than an RPG. Every new route in town presenting you with a cornucopia of micro decisions. We sit down at our metaphorical desk and crunch the numbers. What are my current team stats and how did we fare against our last gym fight? And what kind of gym are we going up against next? Who's close to gaining a level and what's our current moveset looking like? Are we missing any type advantages and what new players are new to this route? Then we have to get down to business. It may be time to let someone go. Is someone not pulling their weight? When we perfect the skill of managing our team, we start making these decisions with an ice-cold pleasure. The sentimentality of my first Pidgey I caught on Route 1 trickles away. I'm sorry, we're just not seeing the results anymore. Banished forever to the depths of a box inside of a PC made by a sociopath named Bill, left wondering what could have been. We move on filling this position with an RNG manipulated Mew, itself resigned to an arguably worse life, an HM slave, never to exist outside of its purpose of holding permanent moves I dare not taint my actual team's move list with, and only called upon for physical labor on the overworld. It's just good business. However, Pokemon tips its hand as early as possible. In the Viridian Forest, we face off against teams of the same 3 Pokemon, all bug-type, all with only 2 moves. These trainers, most of whom seem to be mirroring a similar age as our protagonist, may get a sympathetic excuse from a first-time player. They're all young and seemingly early on in their own Pokemon journey. Maybe these trainers just don't know any better. But it gets worse. Gyms are based around the same type preference of a chosen elite trainer. Adult in age with years of experience in training and raising Pokemon, these gym leaders have resigned themselves each to only one specific type or theme of Pokemon to comprise their team with. By the time I had reached Pewter City, home to gym leader Brock, I had a decent team of Pokemon. Diverse with different types, and my starter Charmander, already at level 16, evolved into its second evolution. And I'm hardly 20 minutes into my Pokemon journey. Was part of the job requirement to be a gym leader to only use a team of one type and have as few as Pokemon as possible? Is it their intention to challenge my knowledge of type advantages and ability to raise my Pokemon, or to see if I'm mentally capable of passing the 3rd grade? The gym leaders have all clearly lied on their resumes. Come on, Misty. At least throw a Beedrill in there to balance things out. This is true for nearly all trainer battles in the game. When we realize this, the game is broken. In a world of adult trainers, some of which whose literal paid job is to grade our knowledge of battle, we, a simple teenager, are the smartest person alive. Worse yet, even the most difficult type advantage can be overcome by the secret weapon of all RPG likers, grinding. I figured this out and ran with it for 3 generations until I gave the series up. I only ever used my starter in battle. I stood ironclad by the knowledge that diversity in my team would not help me when all I needed to do was be a few levels over my opponents, allowing me the first strike and ultimately one-shotting every enemy's Pokemon I came up against. I felt like a monster and a fraud. Of course, the competitive scene would laugh in your face at this notion, but the closest you come to what a real person would do in this game are the rival fights. Later revisions to typing and movesets made this more difficult, but I always made it through each game without much challenge, minus the occasional gym battle. I knew what I was doing was wrong and twisted, forcing my closest companion into every fight, not allowing even a moment's rest. But the challenge appealed to me. The glittering light of the easiest way out was just visible enough for my young mind. The game, almost as if reading my intentions, provides the player with one final challenge, and a warm side of difficulty spike with the Elite Four. The original Elite Four may as well have been the four horsemen to my own childhood apocalypse. Never before in the game had we encountered such opponents. The time of triggering an encounter with a bug catcher that had literally 3 Metapod was over. This was the real deal. Locked into 4 fights of full teams of high-level Pokemon, the game chose one final shot at challenging my egotistic team-building ethos. I had prepared myself for this final challenge as well as my young brain could. After several failed attempts over several days, when my grandparents came down to visit one particular night. We had chosen to go eat at my family's choice to be the next Michelin star recipient, the Western Sizzlin'. The Western Sizzlin' was just a step up from your average Midwest buffet, evidenced by the mere existence of a menu and the waiter's preferred dress code of a polo shirt. Specializing in cooked-to-your-preference steaks, the real prize, outside of escaping the LA skyline haze of a smoking section, were the hash browns. I would have to play hard and accurately if I wanted to finish the Elite Four this night. Prior to this attempt, they had bested me just short of seeing the very last of Lance's lineup. I knew I could beat one member waiting on my grandparents to arrive, one on the drive to the restaurant, and one waiting on the meal. And then the last one on the short ride back to our house just in time to enjoy a well-earned victory. So I had carried out my plan. I enacted each step of the plan with the sensibilities of a jewel heist. Each of my previous attempts were just myself casing out the place. My small stockpile of potions were vital to the plan, pouring them down the throat of my Charizard like they were Norman Reedus putting back Monster Energy in Hideo Kojima's The Death Stranding. Though I knew the plan would be smooth for the first 3 members of the Elite Four, my problem was Lance. Lance's level 62 Dragonite and level 60 Aerodactyl were the only 2 obstacles keeping me from becoming the Pokemon champion. I knew it would take more luck than skill, a critical hit or miss or 2. I had thought about the battle with Lance while I was finishing my meal. I booted up the Game Boy while the adults were talking, and in between bites of my father's favorite item, the last crispy remnants of a full order of home-style hash browns lay speared by the little plastic pitchforks meant to inform a patron of the establishment of the temperature of their piece of fire-grilled bovine. The sweat began to pour as I destroyed his Aerodactyl, and we started our single-file march to the car. I was in decent enough shape for his final Dragonite, each of us down to our last few hit points when I pressed A for my last attack. I watched the last bit of health trickle out of his pathetic creature. I had finally did it. I had survived with hardly anything left, but I had finally accomplished my goal. The lights in the car seemed to dim, my face hot from the excitement as I told my grandmother in the car with us, "You must be my good luck charm." Of course, anyone my age who played this as a child knew from the onset of this story there would not be a happy ending. One more surprise fight with our rival, recently turned champion, and he crushed me, grinding whatever dreams I had of beating the game into sawdust. The weight of all our previous encounters, in which I had utterly annihilated him, pressed down upon me with the weight I would not soon forget. I would never forget that defeat, though it would lead me to double down on my plan to pour all my resources into my starter. Eventually, I would beat him with that Charizard, the eventual win far less savory than I had expected. The guilt that all JRPG game likers inevitably go through after grinding out for a hard boss set in. My first experience with such a feeling. The thought of, "You didn't really beat him though, did you?" played over and over in my head. Pokemon, as my first experience with JRPGs, was bittersweet. The fragile and easily exploitable battle system imprinting bad habits that would cast a long and looming shadow over my experience with several other more polished RPGs. Pokemon battles are less about showing mastery over your Pokemon and the game's systems and more about showing your mastery over memorizing type advantages. The only problem is the trainers and other battles in the game rarely give you the excuse to exercise your mastery over either. Or worse yet, it's about how many levels you're willing to grind to practically bypass those type advantages and weaknesses in the first place. Pokemon is rock, paper, scissors with health bars, where if you play enough, your rock can one-shot paper too.
It's always there to help. Sometimes friends are good to have. Of course, that totally depends on the friend. Dude, what's this? It's Hey You, Pikachu. Dude, can I play? Now I'm everybody's best friend.
Video games were not exactly popular where I live, and definitely not popular amongst popular kids when I went to school. I can count on my hand the amount of times someone has shared an interest in the video games I had an interest in. Only 2 of them were when I was a kid in school. For exactly 1 year, I played in my elementary school's football program, the Mighty Mites. Like many rural schools, playing sports was an instant ticket to being liked by other students and a sure way to be liked by the ever-elusive opposite sex. In a vain and short-sighted attempt to gain this attention, and in a small capacity, an attempt to discover something I could maybe be good at, I signed up. I was terrible. I did, however, gain the ability to sit with the other football players during breakfast. It was there, one fated morning, the most popular guy in school, our quarterback, and several other players were talking about Kingdom Hearts. Specifically, the difficulty of the Riku Ansem fight. This may sound shocking to anyone knowledgeable of how the series is perceived today. Before the myriad of spin-offs and prequels, before Hot Topic sold exclusive merchandise, and long before the mere mention of Tetsuya Nomura's name struck an equal amount of anticipation and fear into the hearts of game likers worldwide. Kingdom Hearts was just a game, a fun action game that came out at a particular time when fun action games were the kind of thing my age group actually appreciated about video games. Offering to beat the fight for him was a small glimpse into the kind of playground strategizing that happened daily when talking with other kids about Pokémon. Think back to the first week of Pokémon Go, and that's the level of buzz we're talking about here. Trading tips and tricks was only the tip of the iceberg here. The GameBoy link cable allowed us to hold vicious, digital dogfighting exhibitions under the jungle gym. The absolute thrill of running through your friend's team of Pokemon while the rest of the playground gathered around and cheered louder than any professional sporting event. Pokemon was a sport, a hobby for collectors, a collectible trading game, even before the cards came out. Pokemon wore many hats. It was an open-world adventure game, a monster-taming hunting adventure, and in the meta sense, it was an MMO. This innovation is what suckered us all into the ever-increasing list of merchandise the IP produced. Pokemon the Show, Pokemon the Cards, Pokemon the Movies, exclusive cards packaged with Happy Meals and Kids Meals at Burger King, Pokemon Stadium for the N64, Pokemon Snap. If you were nerdy, cool, a boy or a girl, you knew and participated in some way with Pokemon. If you ever got tired of Pokemon, you had off-brand Pokemon, also called Digimon, which came with an equal amount of various forms of entertainment products and media. And when we hit that age that we all inevitably do, when the kid stuff just doesn't hit the same as it used to, but we're not quite ready for our mom to sell everything in a yard sale, there was Yu-Gi-Oh! To carry us through middle school. Impossible! All of these owe their very creation to the success of Pokemon. Years after the release of the original Pokemon games, I would find myself in my teenage years, as I would most nights, at my friend Sean's house. There, me and my other 3 closest friends would engage in whatever activity appealed to us on that particular day. Gaming, movie watching, underage drinking. This particular night, a long since buried form of competition reared its glorious head. Nestled in a small container, which namesakingly contained many old Game Boy Advance games, lay 2 glistening copies of the 3rd generation of Pokemon games, Pokemon Emerald and Pokemon Sapphire. Beside it lay the straw that broke the camel's back, a fresh Game Boy link cable. The challenge was simple. My friend and I would each take a copy of the game, and armed with 1 whole week of preparation, we would reconvene and see whose Pokemon team-building sensibilities were the strongest. As stated in the previous section of this review, my claim was clear. A power-leveled starter would be more than capable of dealing with a more diverse team of average-level trash. I crushed him at the end of the week. I absolutely murdered him. This was the power that Pokemon games contained, and a huge reason that the games are still so popular today. If you pick any day of the week and go to a park near where I live, you will find people still trying to figure out how to track down Pokemon in Pokemon Go. The age of these people is the smoking gun clue for figuring out just how addictive Pokemon was to us as kids. Pokemon hooked you as a child with its social implications, and you still crave it to this day. Though gone are the days in which we could receive a special treat for dining at our nearest Burger King during special Pokemon promotional events, the passion for putting in the extra legwork just to impress our friends still exists in all of our hearts to one degree or another. In a time now where my age and responsibility has caught up to me more and more every year, moments with people I would call my best friends are rare. It's hard to say whether or not it has more to do with my personality or just a shift in my priorities, or maybe they needed to go their own way too. But I find myself thinking of them often, yet each month that goes by it gets harder to find the time to hang out with them. Texts are hard because each conversation ends with a lie. Let's get together soon. I mean it, but the intent melts away in between shifts and bills. I think back to the time that we played Pokemon at Sean's house. That wasn't something that we played very often. In fact, there were plenty of other games and things that we liked doing way better. But the journey that Pokemon invites you on, the one I re-experienced making this video, is synonymous with my feelings about my friends. It's a brief journey we're all on. Some people stay in your life and some leave. The ending of all my favorite video games always make me a little melancholic, but the feeling that came with finally being Pokemon was almost unbearable for a brief moment as a child. The weight of having experienced a journey with friends that I had made. Little Tamagotchis that, even if they weren't used in battle, were along for the ride. I may have been too young and unexperienced in life to understand why I felt the way I did about my digital adventure ending, but I do now more than ever. Pokemon was the person we used to know. Was it a summer thing or more serious? Either way, it was over too soon. And there, sitting on the fire escape of our studio apartments, we had that last conversation. From time to time, we think back to Pokemon, about catching them all, but the realization sits in. Pokemon let us move on without it. The soft, rounded edges of the pillowy creatures replaced by edgy abominations brought about by ancient Egyptian black magic. One by one, our friends moved on until we were the last one left. The other end of our link cables left dangling. It was time for us to go too. Pokemon is, above all things to me, a glimpse back in time. I'm instantly transported back to snapshots of my life when I was younger, when things were more simple. It was my first real obsession. I've moved on from the series because I outgrew it. Though its lessons and concepts are so hammered into my skull, I could never forget the level of innovation crammed into those 512 kilobytes. In many ways, it's the perfect example of the innovation that's currently lacking in gaming today. Everything now is so constrained by financial goals. Video game products can't afford to be failures. I crave for video game developers to reach the level of creativity it takes to make a game, like Game Freak did in the 90s. I try my part as the consumer by managing my expectations. Instead of asking for more, I try and remember that the game I want to play is still just a game. I want to have a good time with it, and I don't need to ask for more, regardless of the level of hype drummed up by game studios. Recently, I examined the Resident Evil 2 remake on this channel. I did this just before the Resident Evil 4 remake was slated for release. Since that video, the Dead Space and the Resident Evil 4 remake have released to worldwide acclaim. The latter seemingly on track to receive just as much praise and accolades as its original iteration did. And both games crushed a direct competitor in the Callisto Protocol. What do these two remakes being so successful over such a newly anticipated game mean? For me, it's the creativity. It's saying that a video game is just that, a video game. I've explored this a little in my previous review, but I hope games are starting to circle back to when they were the most fun. A time when they were made more simple. A time when developers were allowed to make some more bold choices about the things in their games. We're slowly coming back to a time where linear games are okay. Where gaming protagonists don't have their murderous abilities contextualized by their desire to protect a child or another loved one. We're coming back to a time where games are okay laughing at themselves again. A time where games are fun again. When I see new games like Final Fantasy XVI embrace linearity, all in the name of delivering a fully playable from day one gaming experience, when Square has spent the last decade chasing trends popular in the Western AAA market, gives me plenty of hope that there are developers out there that aren't afraid to do more with less. A lesson that Pokémon taught us over 20 years ago.